Karoline arrived at the towering news studio, a bastion of modern journalism where narratives were shaped, scrutinized, and often dismantled under the unrelenting gaze of the media. The glass walls reflected the city skyline, the world outside moving at its usual hurried pace, oblivious to the quiet storm about to unfold within. Inside, the studio was a controlled chaos of whispered instructions, flashing monitors, and the meticulous adjustments of lighting rigs. It was a place where every detail was curated for impact, and tonight, the focus was on her. She had been in similar settings before, yet there was always a certain weight to stepping onto a stage where opinions were dissected, sometimes twisted, for public consumption. Karoline, however, carried herself with an ease that set her apart. She was neither boastful nor apprehensive, but rather steady, an unshaken presence in a world that thrived on controversy. She knew what was coming. The interviewer waiting for her was not one to indulge in pleasantries. Michael was a journalist with a reputation carved from years of prying open the contradictions in his subjects. He had built his career on his ability to challenge, to provoke, and to expose. His interviews were known for their surgical precision, stripping away facades to reveal vulnerabilities that his audience found both riveting and damning. Tonight, his target was Faith, Karoline's faith, to be exact. He was not interested in soft questions or personal affirmations, he wanted to test the foundation of her beliefs, to see if it would hold under scrutiny or crumble like so many others before her. Behind the scenes, producers moved with brisk efficiency, ensuring the show's seamless execution. A countdown blinked in red on a screen. The control room hummed with low conversation as the director signaled final adjustments. Karoline took her seat opposite Michael, separated only by the sleek surface of the interview table and a chasm of unspoken intent. The cameras positioned themselves like silent observers, ready to capture every micro-expression, every hesitation, every flicker of doubt. Michael studied her as the crew made their final preparations. He had interviewed politicians who dodged, celebrities who spun stories, and so-called thought leaders who crumbled the moment their contradictions were laid bare. But Karoline was different. There was nothing rehearsed about her demeanor, no air of defiance, no flicker of insecurity. It intrigued him. He had seen many claim conviction before, yet few had been able to maintain it once the questioning truly began. She was an enigma in an era where faith often felt performative, where belief was measured by the external rather than the internal. And that was precisely what Michael intended to challenge. Faith without symbols, was it truly faith at all? The studio lights dimmed, then flared to life as the countdown reached 0. The familiar theme music faded. The host leaned forward slightly, his hands resting lightly on the table, his tone poised between curiosity and skepticism. The cameras captured every detail as the interview began, and the world watched, waiting to see if Karoline's certainty would endure or if, like so many before her, she would find herself unraveling under the weight of Michael's questions. The moment the cameras went live, the interview took on an air of controlled intensity. Michael, ever the seasoned journalist, wasted no time establishing his rhythm. His voice was steady, his delivery carefully calibrated to appear fair yet probing. He acknowledged Karoline's reputation, her influence, and the respect she had garnered from those who admired her unshakable faith. But admiration alone was not the point of this interview. He had a narrative to push, a challenge to present. His gaze flickered toward the subtle details of her appearance, or rather, the lack of expected ones. No cross hung around her neck, no religious insignia adorned her clothing. She was dressed simply, professionally, but absent of any outward declaration of belief. This was his entry point. He framed his question in a way that, on the surface, seemed like mere curiosity, but underneath, it carried the weight of skepticism. How, he suggested, could someone who spoke so often about faith not outwardly display it? Wasn't faith something meant to be seen, to be recognized by others? The atmosphere in the studio shifted almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of shift that seasoned interviewers and veteran guests alike could detect, a tightening of the air, an unspoken anticipation. Karoline did not react immediately. She did not shift uncomfortably, nor did she offer the reflexive protests that many might have expected. Instead, she allowed the silence to settle between them for a moment, an act that was, in itself, an answer. Michael watched her closely, looking for the telltale signs of unease, an averted gaze, a tensing of the shoulders, a shallow breath. But there was none. She remained poised, her expression unreadable yet open. She was not thrown off balance, nor did she seem insulted. She considered the question as if it had been asked in good faith rather than as a calculated challenge. And yet, Michael was not done. He had spent years perfecting the art of deconstructing public figures, of peeling back the polished responses to reveal contradictions. If she would not respond with immediate defensiveness, he would push further. He wove his words carefully, implying rather than outright stating his doubt. Without a visible symbol of faith, what separated conviction from mere words? There were, after all, countless individuals who spoke of belief but lived in contradiction. Weren't symbols necessary to affirm authenticity? If faith was truly a defining part of her life, why was there no tangible evidence of it? His tone was not aggressive, but it carried the subtle weight of expectation. He was waiting for her to falter, to justify herself in a way that would expose uncertainty. The silence that followed was more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. Karoline's response was measured, not reactionary, not defensive, but deliberate. She did not scramble to defend herself, nor did she offer the kind of response that sought approval. There was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself, a certainty that did not require embellishment. Still, Michael was relentless in his pursuit. He was not satisfied with answers that could not be dissected, analyzed, or used to build a counterpoint. He needed something concrete, something that would give his audience reason to question. He leaned into his argument, suggesting that faith, when genuine, was something that naturally sought expression. Wasn't it a contradiction to claim faith yet refuse to display it? The tension in the studio had become almost palpable. Those behind the cameras, the producers watching from the control room, all recognized the moment for what it was, a pivotal shift in the conversation. This was no longer a standard interview. It had become something more. Karoline's expression remained unchanged, though there was something in her eyes that deepened. She was not unaffected, she was engaged, fully present, but her calmness remained unshaken. Where others might have met skepticism with indignation, she met it with reflection. Michael, despite his experience, found himself momentarily at an impasse. He was used to provoking a reaction, to seeing frustration rise in the eyes of his guests. But Karoline was neither flustered nor offended. She did not attempt to prove herself, and in doing so, she had created an entirely different kind of challenge, one that was not about argument, but about presence. The cameras caught every nuance, every subtle shift in expression. Those watching from their screens, whether in agreement or skepticism, could sense that something significant was unfolding. The interview had taken on a weight that was no longer about mere words, but about conviction itself. And yet, Michael was not ready to concede. He pressed forward, determined to find the angle that would shift the balance in his favor. But what he did not yet realize was that the balance had already shifted, not in words, but in the quiet, unwavering strength of the woman sitting across from him. A moment of stillness filled the studio. The tension that had been building did not break into confrontation but settled into something heavier, something unspoken yet undeniable. Karoline did not meet Michael's challenge with the defensiveness he had likely anticipated. There was no shift in her expression, no flicker of irritation. Instead, she sat with his words, as if weighing them with the same patience one might give to a deeply personal thought. She did not attempt to argue the premise of his question. Instead, she reframed it, subtly shifting the weight of expectation. Was faith truly measured by what could be seen? Or was its truest form something deeper, something that did not require validation? The idea was not new, but the way she presented it made it feel like something different. Faith, she suggested, was not an accessory to be worn for recognition, nor was it something that demanded public acknowledgement. It was something far more intimate, woven into the way one lived, into the way one treated others when no one was watching. She spoke not in grand declarations, not in carefully curated phrases meant to sound profound, but with a steady conviction that carried its own weight. It was in the way a person chose kindness over cruelty, in the moments when honesty was harder but still chosen, in the quiet acts of generosity that never made their way into headlines. Faith was not about symbols, it was about substance. Michael, so used to guests scrambling to defend themselves, seemed momentarily caught off guard. He had expected explanations that attempted to justify, not a shift in perspective that dismantled the premise of his argument altogether. But he was not the type to concede easily. He searched for the weakness in her words, the inconsistency that would expose a contradiction. Without external representation, how could faith be recognized? Without symbols, how could it be shared with others? The world, after all, was full of people who claimed belief but lived in opposition to their own words. Wasn't the presence of something tangible, something visible, necessary to separate sincerity from hypocrisy? Karoline did not flinch at the implication. Instead, she met it with quiet certainty. Faith, she explained, was not about performing for an audience. Those who needed symbols to affirm belief were not always those who truly lived by it. A cross around the neck, a verse displayed prominently, these things meant nothing if the actions behind them did not align. To her, faith was not about convincing others. It was about living with integrity, with conviction that did not waver whether it was acknowledged or not. It was in the quiet strength of someone who showed up for others without expectation, in the resilience of those who held on to hope even when it seemed invisible. She offered something personal, an experience that illustrated her belief. It was not a dramatic story, not something crafted for emotional impact, but something simple, something real. She spoke of a moment in her life when faith had been tested, not in a grand, public way, but in the solitude of a decision no one else had known about. A choice that had cost her, but one she had made anyway, because belief was not about convenience. Michael listened, his usual sharpness tempered by something else. He had expected argument, expected a defense that he could counter, but what he was facing was something different. There was no desire in Karoline to prove him wrong, no need to assert dominance in the conversation. She was not debating him, she was simply speaking the truth as she understood it. That, in itself, was disarming. And yet, he was not ready to let go. He pressed further, testing the boundaries of her certainty, looking for the place where her conviction might waver. But what he had not anticipated was that her strength did not come from a need to be right. It came from the fact that she did not require validation, not from him, not from the audience, not from the world. The cameras captured every detail, the shifting dynamics of a conversation that was no longer a confrontation but something deeper. Karoline had redefined the nature of the discussion, and in doing so, she had forced not only Michael, but everyone watching, to reconsider the very idea of what faith truly meant. Something had changed. It wasn't sudden, not a single moment that could be pinpointed, but rather a gradual shift in the air between them. The interview, which had begun as a controlled exchange of challenge and response, had taken on a different energy, one that Michael hadn't anticipated. He had entered this conversation with the expectation that, at some point, Karoline would falter. That she would feel the weight of his skepticism and begin to justify herself in a way that would expose the fragility of her position. But that moment had never come. Instead, she had remained steady, unaffected by the pressure he had applied. She had not sought to defend herself in the traditional sense, nor had she attempted to convince him of anything. And perhaps that was what unsettled him most. Michael had spent his career uncovering contradictions, peeling back layers of public personas to reveal the inconsistencies that lay beneath. But as he sat across from Karoline, watching her speak with the same quiet conviction she had held from the beginning, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. There was no performance here, no need for validation. She did not shape her words to fit the expectations of her audience, nor did she attempt to wield them as weapons in an argument. She simply existed within the truth she believed, unshaken by whether anyone else accepted it. The cameras continued rolling, capturing everything, the flicker of thought behind Michael's eyes, the subtle tension in his posture. He was beginning to question not just her, but himself. For years, he had assumed that faith, like everything else in the public sphere, was something to be measured, examined, and inevitably broken down into its contradictions. He had seen too many people wield belief as a tool of self-righteousness, using it to gain status, to manipulate, to present an image rather than live by its principles. And so, he had learned to question, to push, to demand proof. But Karoline was unlike the others. She had no interest in proving herself. No need to be validated or understood. Her belief was not a banner she carried for the world to see, it was simply who she was, embedded into her actions, her presence, the very way she carried herself. It was then that Michael realized something else. This was no longer an interview in the way he had intended. It was no longer about exposing weakness, nor was it about winning an intellectual debate. The conversation had shifted into something else entirely, something introspective, something that did not lend itself to quick conclusions or neatly packaged takeaways. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt himself at a loss. His usual methods no longer seemed relevant. He could not challenge her in the way he had planned, because she was not playing the game he had prepared for. The control he prided himself on, the ability to steer conversations toward a predetermined outcome, was slipping. And the worst part? It wasn't because Karoline had outmaneuvered him. It was because she simply refused to engage in the battle he had expected. He adjusted in his seat, aware now that the balance in the room had shifted. This wasn't just about her beliefs anymore. It was about something deeper, about the assumptions he had carried into this moment, the ones he had never thought to question. The cameras remained trained on him, capturing every flicker of hesitation, every subtle crack in the certainty he had walked in with. And somewhere beyond the bright studio lights, the audience watching at home would see it too. For the first time in his career, Michael wasn't sure what his next move should be. Michael knew he was losing control. Not of the interview itself, he was still the one asking the questions, still the one steering the conversation, but of the dynamic that had underpinned every exchange so far. The tension he had intended to build, the slow unraveling of his guest that he had counted on, had never materialized. Instead, something else had taken its place. A quiet, undeniable shift. Yet he wasn't ready to let go completely. He had built a career on maintaining composure, on keeping his grip on discussions no matter how unpredictable they became. He would not simply allow an interview to slip away without regaining some sense of authority. And so, with careful calculation, he made one final push. It was a simple question, but one designed to put pressure on her, to reintroduce the external world into this insular conversation. Did she not care about perception? Did it not trouble her that people might doubt her sincerity, that they might question the authenticity of her faith because she refused to display it? In the space that followed, the air felt heavier. It was not the tension of conflict but the weight of something else, something more profound. Karoline did not rush to fill the silence. She had never done so throughout the course of their conversation, and she would not start now. There was a steadiness to her that Michael had not been able to shake, and it remained as she considered his words, as she prepared her answer. When she finally spoke, her response was as unembellished as every other she had given that evening. She did not argue, did not try to convince, did not attempt to shift the burden of proof onto him. She simply stated a truth, one that belonged to her, and her alone. Faith was not about meeting expectations. It was not about shaping oneself to fit into the mold that others deemed acceptable. It was not about being seen in a certain way, about proving one's beliefs through visible symbols or performative gestures. It was about conviction, about living in alignment with one's values even when others did not understand, even when the world doubted, even when there was nothing to gain from it. She did not say it with arrogance or defiance. There was no need for sharpness or edge in her voice. It was simply a fact. A certainty that did not require external validation. The studio was silent. Michael, for the first time, had no immediate reply. No sharp remark, no skeptical counterpoint. He had spent his entire career navigating conversations with precision, always ready with the next question, always prepared to challenge, dissect, and deconstruct. But this was something different. Because there was no debate left to be had. She had not tried to win anything. And yet, in a way, she had. The moment stretched. The cameras captured everything, the way she sat, composed and at ease, while he remained still, as if recalibrating his own understanding of the conversation. Somewhere beyond the studio walls, millions of people were watching. Some might have agreed with her, some might not have, but none could deny what had just happened. Michael exhaled, barely perceptible, before glancing toward the producer's booth. The show's runtime was nearly over. There was nothing left to say. With practiced professionalism, he signaled the closing of the segment. The lights would soon dim, the credits would roll, and the world would move on. But something about this conversation lingered. Not just for him. For everyone.